So, welcome, John Lawrence Graham, to our Flashback to a Fabulous Future podcast. You've written a book called Charlotte's War, and I read through it. I must admit, I had to skim it pretty fast, but I did enjoy the overall arc of the story and the historical context that was shared. So, if you don't mind just taking a few minutes to introduce who you are, what your background is, and kind of what prompted you to write this book, then we'll go from there.
Great. Cheryl, thanks so much for inviting me on the show. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate your interest in history. That's something we share. My background is I, for 40 years, taught international business at the University of Southern California and at UC Irvine, and at some other universities around the world. But my second love is history, so that's part of the reason why I wanted to do something substantial in the area of history. The purpose in writing the book is to promote peace. And so I have several books that try to do that. Even my business books, mainly I write about international business and international negotiations. And the concept behind that is that the best way to build peace is through international trade. But I also have a couple other books. One is on drug policy. The title of that book is called Spiced, the Global Marketing of Psychoactive Substances. And the purpose of that book, it has a chapter, for example, on salt and sugar and marijuana and alcohol and tobacco and cocaine and opioids. It has each of the chapters and talks about how they're marketed in similar ways. And the peace goal there is to keep peace in the streets. The drug war has been very costly and based on a lot of mistakes in lawmaking and also some terrible marketing practices. Another book I have, we're doing a third edition that'll be out later this year. The current edition is called All in the Family, and it's about multi-generational families, and they were trying to help create peace in the home, particularly trying to settle the problem of baby boomers. And they're certainly in large numbers moving in with their kids, and that will continue for the rest of the century. And so we're trying to create a peaceful, creative atmosphere there. And then Charlotte's War, that's my novel, and this came out just this last May. And it's a book about an extended family trying to navigate through three different wars: World War II, the Korean War, and mostly it's about Vietnam. Charlotte and her son Jack are the main fictional characters. She's basically, I'll get into her character a little bit more, but she was raised in China as the daughter of missionaries there, and she gets a PhD in anthropology and becomes a key peace protester during the Vietnam War. And her son, as did her husband and brother, is headed in the direction of harm's way. And she's trying to bring an early end to the Vietnam War through her various contacts. So that's what the book is about. The historical characters are Henry Kissinger and Ho Chi Minh, and they interact with Charlotte. And that's what most of the book is about. The historical context is completely accurate. I take a few liberties with some conversations between Nixon and Kissinger, but basically it's right out of the history books I studied to bring those characters to life. But whenever they are interacting with Charlotte or other fictional characters, then it is fiction. But anyway, I'm happy to talk about the facts of the Vietnam War. I kind of lived through that area. In addition to my academic background, I also served 9 years in the U.S. Navy in underwater demolition and SEAL teams. In the early 70s, I was on active duty during the Vietnam conflict, although I'm happy to say I was a bench sitter I was not in the war. And then I spent 5 years in the reserves also as an officer in the teams. So that's kind of my mixed background. I have a background in peace and interest in peace, but I also have a deep military experience as well. And I try to use the combination in telling Charlotte's story.
Yes, thank you. And I think one thing that you and I definitely share is a desire for peace. Now, and I'm sure you would also agree with this, I've had some conversations prior to this, but is that peace doesn't always come because we always agree on issues or that we see things through the same, lens. History can be either viewed or interpreted. As a student of history yourself and myself too, sometimes I will read about an incident in history and read three different authors' interpretation of what happened. And it can be like, oh my goodness, is this even the same event that happened? Because people see things so differently. And I think that's good. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that it's really helpful. The more perspectives we have, I think the better decisions that we make moving forward. If we only look at things through one lens, then we tend to want to move forward either from that perspective or because of that perspective. I appreciate, and as I was reading through the book, Charlotte's War, there were some times in there, I find myself maybe disagreeing a little bit, but I thought, this is interesting. And as I read on a little bit more, I was like, oh, I can see how he, came to that conclusion, or how, and then it in some instances would change my mind. In other instances, it would, I wouldn't say reaffirm my own position, but it just made me look at things differently. And I think that's something really important in the world we live in today, is to be able to think critically and to look at things through different lenses.
Sure, sure. And there's another reason why the different lenses are important, and maybe we'll get to that. But one of the great things about cultural diversity, or diversity generally, is it puts different ideas on the table if people are willing to listen. And that leads to creative outcomes where everybody is better off. But the main theme of the book, the main underlying theme, is hopeful. And that is that we're just about through with coercion in international relations. If I look back at World War II, or even go back to World War I, the last century, imperialism basically came to an end. I mean, the big event was the British giving up India. But right after World War II, the United States gave up the Philippines. The French were kind of laggards, and thus we had decades-long war in Vietnam, but they have eventually given up most of their colonies as well. And colonialism, by its nature, is coercive.
I think, our audience probably understands, the first two incidents you gave, with India. But this was something that was very enlightening to me as I was reading through your book, was the connection between the French and Vietnam. I don't think most people realize that connection. Do you mind elaborating a little more on that?
Sure. Indochina, and that includes what is now Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The name refers to the lands in between India and China. And the French turned that into a colony in the mid-1800s. And it stayed that way until 1954. At the end of World War II, during World War II, the Japanese kicked the French out of Indochina and took over. At the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh and his fellows published a Declaration of Independence from France, and then there was a war fought for 9 years between France and the revolutionaries. The interesting historical aspect, one of the many interesting historical aspects, is the Declaration of Independence promulgated by Ho Chi Minh and his colleagues is a love letter to the United States. It directly quotes Jefferson's writing and the others on our Declaration of Independence. And one of the interesting things about it, and I include the whole thing in the book because I think it's important to read the whole thing, never is the word communism mentioned. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh is arguing that the French went out of their way to hurt capitalism among the Vietnamese. And so he's, in his words, he's supportive of capitalism, or as he said, the bourgeoisie of Vietnamese. But anyway, it is interesting. I didn't really know the details until I started researching for the book. I was stationed in the Philippines in 1972. Our folks SEAL team and UDT were operating in Vietnam. And I had been a chemistry major in college, and I really wasn't paying attention to world events at the time. I was just, I had been drafted. I joined the Navy to be safe. I had a wife and a kid, and I felt responsible for them. But I really didn't understand what was going on, and only more recently I've read the history there. And also, I have the benefit, of course, of things like the Pentagon Papers that help understand how America got fouled up in that area of the world as well.
Yes, thank you. Now we can go ahead and move forward with this concept of imperialism. And I think, just in my study of history and after reading through what you've written, our earlier wars were somewhat either freedom fighting wars or for imperialism. And then as we moved into Korea and Vietnam and these types of things, I think the mentality and the dynamics of the wars changed significantly. So if you don't mind kind of going down that road a little bit.
One of the other underlying themes of the book that comes right out of the preface is that we've been misunderstanding Russia and the Soviet Union for more than 100 years. And if you look at the main conflict in the second half of the century, I mean, in World War II, we fought with or beside the Russians against the Germans. We were allies. We gave them many weapons, which we happened to also pass through another ally, which was Iran. So in World War II, we were allied with both Iran and Russia against the Germans. Right after the war, a couple of significant congressional elections were held. One in California in 1946, Richard Nixon ran for Congress in Southern California. And then on the East Coast, John Kennedy ran for Congress in 1946 in Massachusetts. They represented two different views of international relations, and those really translated into the 1960 presidential election. But Kennedy was arguing for engagement, things like international trade. And Nixon's main political tool was scaring people about communism. And the silly thing about that most Americans don't read Karl Marx. Most Americans don't read Adam Smith, actually. But those are the two kind of competing philosophies, both from the 17 and 1800s. And Marx theories about communist revolution only work when you have rich people and poor people, or proletariat and a bourgeoisie, as he described them. If you have a big middle class, you're never going to have a communist revolution. It just doesn't, the theory doesn't make sense. And after World War II, the United States has this huge, powerful middle class. And so Nixon was using fear of communism as a political tool. He described his Democrat competitor in Southern California, the incumbent, as a pinko, literally. And Nixon used that fear of communism throughout his career. And that delivered the Vietnam War to us. That same fear of communism, and it's still happening. We have fear of China right now, but it's not fear of China so much as fear of communist China. And China is really not a communist country anymore. They use that label, But if you go to Shanghai and walk around the shopping district, you can't see communism. You see free enterprise. Yes, it's centrally controlled. That's not a good thing. There are a lot of human rights violations, but China is not a communist country. And but it's still used to motivate votes in this country, and actually by both parties now. I'm glad to see that Biden and Xi are beginning to talk to each other again. At least there's some indication that they're going to do that, because that's actually been quite a good relationship for the last 50 years, a positive relationship, and it's time we get back to that. I mean, the big problem is still Russia, but that's a whole nother issue too.
Yeah, that's, well, let's jump back a little bit because it makes me think of something. In terms of Nixon, prior to Watergate and all of the controversy there, don't necessarily want to get into all of that, but he was known for having these, and Kissinger having reached out to China and built these good relationships with China that then deteriorated after they were gone. And that's what's been promoted in many historical records. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it was a big deal for Nixon to go to China, although the history of it is there were some congressional members who were thinking of trying to reach détente with China as well. Prominent is Teddy Kennedy was talking about going there. But Nixon and Kissinger did break the ice. Their goal in the negotiations in 72, and they went in February 72, and they went to China, was to get China to lean on Vietnam to capitulate to American demands. And what the Chinese goals were to get the United States to let China take over Taiwan. So neither of those political goals were achieved. Some really good film came back from those meetings that had an effect on Nixon's 1972 election. So that was a benefit to the Nixon camp. But the real accomplishment there was the opening of trade, and that was mostly handled by the Secretary of State at the time. So opening China was great. They've been a hugely important trading partner and still are, even this most recent year, despite all the criticisms and the way Trump treated China. They're still very important. And so that you can give Nixon and Kissinger credit for making that détente work. They also, for that matter, substantially reduced nuclear weapons. But their behavior with respect to Vietnam was just awful. If you look at the history, they basically stretched out the war an extra 4 years. The Johnson administration in November of 68 was ready to settle with the Vietnamese, and Nixon worked. It's not clear how much Kissinger was involved, but the Nixon administration worked against that settlement through informal sources. Many people think that was treason because, in any case, that disruption in the negotiations in Paris in 1968 made the war last another 4 years and cost thousands of Americans' lives and millions of Vietnamese lives.
Yeah. And I just, for clarification for my audience, my own personal stance is that politicians in general, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, are both equal opportunity opportunists and equal opportunity offenders. So I see things depending on the day and the issue, it's a little bit in different ways. But let's jump back to JFK, because I think people perceive, and I could be wrong, but I kind of grew up, I was a baby boomer, with JFK being in support of the war. And I know we're venturing into conspiracy theory area, don't really want to go down there, but if you have any factual information, from what I read, I don't know who killed Kennedy, don't really care at this point in time. I mean, I do, but it's a conversation for a different day. but I don't think it's any coincidence that both JFK and his brother Robert were killed. I mean, there's just no, but that Kennedy favored the war, when in reality, the things that I have read about Kennedy it was his opposition to the war that probably made some enemies.
It was interesting. Right at the beginning of the book, we look at the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates. And those are really interesting because Nixon was arguing, as usual, Red Scare, hardline, get tough with the Russians and the Chinese. And Kennedy was arguing more for engagement, for things like the Peace Corps and having ambassadors learn languages. And he was interested in trade. But he did in the debates say things about communism as slavery. And so the general belief on both sides of the aisle was that communism was a danger, particularly in international relations. So I agree completely. If you look at Vietnam, maybe the worst decision maker than Nixon was Johnson. Johnson just poured troops and weaponry into Vietnam. It's hard to say what Kennedy would have done facing the same circumstances. He had been sending, Kennedy before he died he created SEAL team and the Green Berets specifically to train people in other countries, do proxy wars. But that missions creeped in Vietnam, and both those things that he created got involved in combat. And Kennedy lied about that on television in people's living rooms at the time. But I don't know where Kennedy would have taken it had he survived, or for that matter, his brother. His brother was arguing for peace in Vietnam, and had he been elected against Nixon, and he may very well have been, things would have turned out differently, I'm sure. But the guy that really took the violent approach in Vietnam was Johnson. And Nixon started pulling troops out right away. And I was the beneficiary of that. When I was stationed in the Philippines, we trained some Vietnamese frogmen how to get in and out of a submarine. And it was toward the goal of Vietnamization. That was the word of the war. And through his term beginning in 68 and going all the way to 72, he continued to pull troops out while he was bombing the hell out of places like Laos and Cambodia, illegally, by the way, and also North Vietnam. So he was using both tools, a very large stick, but also the carrot of the reality of the war would never be won, so to speak.
Yeah. And just switch gears just a little bit here. And I find this very interesting because I think we don't talk about, Korea, Vietnam, those periods of time very much because of the controversy surrounding them. And I think there's just, I don't know, there's too many political players that I think have either been glamorized or villainized, depending on how people view things. But in your book, Charlotte's War, there's a couple things that I thought were interesting that came out early on, with the advent of the radio. And I mean, people having radios in their house. I realize radios came prior to World War II, but in addition to that, television, Kennedy was so charismatic, and so, his ability to communicate with an audience, especially over TV, I think really helped him significantly. And I'd like to talk a little bit about technology and its impact on politics as it started there. The other thing I'd like to get to, and we can get through the technology discussion first, is in the book Charlotte's War, Charlotte she was engaged or whatever to this young man, and they weren't married, and she ended up, getting pregnant. And it was after that period of time when birth control kind of came onto the scene. And I find it interesting, another interesting discussion on the impact that, birth control played a significant role in changing the whole dynamic of women's rights and women's, ability to be more integrated into everyday work society, I guess. Charlotte, as you mentioned, was an anthropologist. Is that right?
Yes.
That's the title. Yeah. And, she did have pretty good success for her period of time. So anyway, if you could jump back to what you believe is, the impact of technology on politics, and then we can move into the other discussion.
Well, we can talk about TV and birth control. Both important technologies that have had a huge impact on everyday life and world politics, and have the potential for even more, thankfully. I'll go back to the term. Well, let's see. Let's start with TV. So in the preface, I talk about a trip I took to Russia. This is real history, real experience I had. In the preface, I went to Russia in 1989. I was there to teach Russians how to negotiate with Americans and Japanese, because the Russians were interested in, this was when Gorbachev came into office, and they were interested in using trade to further their interests. Really what was going on at that point in time is the Japanese were killing us both economically. They didn't spend anything on the military, and so Japan was taking over the world, changing the game to economics instead of military power. But anyway, back in '89, one of the things I did is I saw the first televised debate between Gorbachev and a political opponent. And I saw it in a resort hotel northeast of Moscow. And the hotel, there's a big TV in the lobby, and nobody was outside. Everybody was in watching that debate because they had never seen such a thing. So the 1960 debates were important because they changed this. Charisma happened in your living room. All of a sudden, you could see a politician in your living room saying what they were going to do, lying what they might do, all those kinds of things. And one of Nixon's big problems, which I mentioned in the analysis, one of the things I study is nonverbal behaviors in negotiation. And Nixon was blinking a lot, which is usually a tell for a lying. And, whether people became conscious of that or not, you can look back at these because they're on, the debates are all on YouTube. It's quite interesting to see Nixon's problem with honesty. And he told some whoppers during those debates. So that, now you've got all kinds of high tech playing into things. I mean, and I started the book in 1938, and in one sense it was, Charlotte was a mother when TV came out, and so it was the television generation arguing with the radio generation. And of course, then we have the internet, we have all the screens all over the house, basically, let alone other kinds of IT. And now we have artificial intelligence. All that is hard to know where it's all going, particularly related to warfare. The drones are completely changing things. I was laughing about Top Gun Maverick, the most recent movie that was a big hit. And that movie makes no sense at all in an age of drones. So that was interesting to see. Yeah. But birth control, I want to talk about birth control real quick. And it relates to peace building in an important way. One of the best books I've ever read is by Steven Pinker. He's a linguistics expert at Harvard, but he wrote a book called The Better Nature of Our Angels. And it's a book about peace and how we are living in probably the most peaceful time the world has ever seen. Now, that sounds like a crazy talk when you've got all these murders going on in the United States and this war in Ukraine and Russia. But if you look at the numbers, if you look at the trend lines and not the headlines, then you realize that the world is actually quite peaceful right now. And he explains 4 reasons. And I won't go into all 4. I just want to focus on the one that you mentioned. But of the 4 reasons, one is rule of law. People are paying more attention to rule of law. One is rule of reason. So a lot of the wars in the past were based on religious reasons. And now we have fewer wars because we aren't fighting so many of those. The third thing he mentions is women. He found that when women were higher up in government, there tended to be less military solutions to problems. And then the fourth one I like is with more trade, you get less war. But birth control changed society and changed the roles of both men and women. And they're still changing. But with women in more powerful political positions, they're basically shedding the coercion of the United States by men in the past century. And so coercion is going away in this century, not only in international relations, but also in relations in American homes and neighborhoods and in politics.
Yeah, those are very interesting points, and I agree. Jumping back a little bit to the technology, back in the days of Nixon and JFK, I'm sure they were not prepped as much for their, television appearances. It was more like, oh, let's put some makeup on. Here's some questions you're going to be asked. Here's some counter arguments that you might want to make, kind of thing. But nowadays, I almost find it, I use this word very loosely, but unnecessary to have these televised debates because they're so scripted and they're so soundbite oriented. And, it's hard to catch somebody lying because you can't really dig into the details of things. And, they're trained to avoid these kind of behaviors that might indicate, like in a practice debate, somebody might say, oh, your eyes are blinking too much, so you don't want to do that because it'll come across as that you're lying. So I think it's interesting that, how much it changed the political landscape at the time. And then technology has continued to do so. But one of the things that I like to focus on in our podcast here is, how can we take what we've learned from the past and move forward and with a blueprint? And I really, really am a proponent of exploring the law of unintended consequences. I think technology is great. I love technology. It's allowing us to have a conversation, you in California, me in Virginia. And I use technology. I use artificial intelligence. But on the flip side, I see the potential that it's had, with all of this discussion since the 2016 election about Russian interference in the elections and all of this fake news and all of this, misinformation, disinformation. Technology's opened up that whole new thing. And I'm not sure we could have predicted that. Maybe so. I mean, I already look at artificial intelligence and I'm like, ooh, I can already see some real problems with it, like deep fakes and things like that. On the political side of things, but I can also see a tremendous amount of harm that it can do. But I also see all the good that it can do. So that's where I think having these open, broad discussions where everybody comes together and says, here's my ideas, your ideas, you're going to see things from a different perspective so that we can create a blueprint moving forward. And with the birth control issue, I totally agree. It opened up so many doors for women that just weren't there. And I do think it's had an impact overall on the world and its peacekeeping efforts. I think that's great. But just recently, and I guess it's of some interest to me because, I took birth control when I was younger and then had a hard time getting pregnant. And then I have since been finding more and more studies that say, oh, if you take birth control for an extended period of time, and I mean 10 years plus or something, and then you decide you want to get pregnant, it can inhibit your ability to get pregnant. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that's, some of the information that's coming out. So for all these things that are really good, and there's always a downside to something. And so I don't think that we should say no more birth control. That's not the solution by any means. Or women, stay home. That's not the solution. Or get rid of technology. That's not the solution. But that's why I like having these discussions, because I think it helps people see things through a much larger lens, and hopefully we'll never be able to predict the future. Of course, all these sci-fi books would help us on some level. I think some people are very creative in their interpretation of what the future could bring. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you've raised a lot of different
Yeah, I know.
things to talk about. But let me go back to TV. And what TV did was really to elections in the United States was it just brought a ton of money in. And really the country's electoral system is corrupted, not in the way Trump complains, but it's corrupted by all the billions of dollars flowing through getting on television advertising and other kinds of advertising. And the people in Congress and in government are not interested in changing that. And the only thing that's going to change it, I think, is if individuals start asking sitting politicians a very simple question. The question is, do donations to your campaign influence your voting? And they're going to say no. They're going to lie to your face. But we need to be asking that questions and get that basic truth out on the table, because all these men and women in politics are hugely influenced by the big companies spending big money and the rich, very rich, spending big money. And citizens aren't being represented. That's why everybody is so cranky with government generally. It's not just the Republicans or the Democrats, it's both of them. Mm-hmm. Because government isn't serving the people the way it was intended. And the parties are both to blame. Mm-hmm. If you go back in history, George Washington thought political parties were a bad idea. And that's really true, because the candidates represent the parties and the money that the parties raise. They don't represent their constituents.
That's interesting, because I very aware of George Washington's comment, and I highly respect George Washington. I'm not trying to take anything away from him at all, but I'm like, okay, then what was your solution? How would we do this? Just everybody kind of, everybody run who wants to run. And yeah, I agree. And I go look at FEC filings and see who's donating to your politician, your favorite politician's, campaigns. Yep. But I also think technology can also possibly be a solution to this, because we can organize more grassroots efforts and we can have more conversations like this, just amongst everyday people. And I don't have a political agenda on this podcast. I don't get the impression you have a real political agenda. You have an agenda, and it's to bring peace, but that is not necessarily, I don't see that as a political agenda. I just see that as, a worthwhile pursuit. And so I think technology, has brought about our ability to do that. So I think that's wonderful. And I think we need to embrace that and find ways to use that in a, productive way.
Well, I think the main thing is to elect independents. Mm-hmm. And who will promise to represent people, not the money. It's really a congressional campaign you can do for about $25,000 as a minimum campaign. One of the things that's nice about the internet is people can easily look at where a candidate stands on the website, if they'll bother to do it. But right now, people are getting too much information from the television,
Mhm.
which is controlled by the money.
Mhm.
And so I see hope for the technology helping in that, just as you described, helping us communicate better. But the people have to stand up against all this money being spent, because I mean, if you make a small donation, you get no attention from your congressional representative. The congressional representatives are paying attention to the party, which is in many cases their biggest donor, but also the big donors. And so we people are being served by the current political system. And I think we ought to be comparing to how they do it in other countries. I don't know if the British Parliament has the same kinds of problems, but anyway,
Yeah,
another big topic.
yeah, it is. I mean, we could have a whole nother, podcast on this topic, but I do think you're right. It's hard for us, and I air quotes here, little people, to recognize the power that we have. We feel so neutered by all of this big money, all these big donations. And I've been trying to pay a lot more attention to my politician. Where does he get his money from? Because you'll hear him on one side say, "Oh, I really am against, all these social media giants." Well, but I look at your FEC filings and I see you're getting mountains of money from them. And then I look at the way you vote and I go, "Oh, I see. You're voting the way they want you to, but you're talking to me the way you think I want to hear." And
Exactly.
it's so hard, but I keep trying to tell people, don't listen to what they say, watch what they do.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to say anything. And so I think we need to really educate people on where to get. And I always encourage people, when you read something, do your best to find the original source and not somebody's interpretation of that source, so that you can, I teach constitution classes and we're talking about various Supreme Court, decisions. And they're like, "Oh, this. And I'm like, "Okay, it's clear you've read a few talking points here and there. Here's the actual decision. Take a few minutes." And even I know they're hard to understand, they're written in legal language and whatever. But if you just read, their summaries, they're not so hard to understand. And I try to point people to various sites where you can see it's easy to look up how your particular politician voted on something. And here's where you can find their FEC filings and see who's donating to their causes. Because I think once people recognize that they can be empowered, and that just it doesn't take an army of people to do this. It just takes small groups of people being persistent and exercising the power that they have. So I'll give you the final word here.
Well, I think the worst example of our political system is the use of fear appeals, and
Mm-hmm.
that we really need a big enemy so we can have a big military budget. And this is something Eisenhower, of course, criticized. Probably Washington and Eisenhower are our greatest generals, but Eisenhower criticized the military-industrial complex. And it's true. I mean, we need China. When the Cold War ended, so to speak, and the wall came down, what the military-industrial complex did was pivot to China in the year 2000,
Mm-hmm.
and in 1999 and 2000, and China became the big enemy. And China is a very weak, big enemy. I mean, the scary one is Russia if you count nuclear warheads. But we spend so much money on defense. If you add in what we spend on VA benefits, it's more than $1 trillion a year. And China is less than 300 million. So we spend so much more money than any of these other countries. Nobody's ever going to attack the United States unless it's something like 9/11. And but we're not going to have a war with China. Neither one of us can afford that war. But yet the politicians, the thing that really makes me an independent is free trade is so important. And you hear all the criticisms of it. And but anyway, free trade is my mantra. The free trade delivers three things. It delivers interdependence between countries. They tend not to fight, and the U.S. and China is a good example of that. We are interdependent. Free trade brings interaction between people in the countries, and they learn about cultures and things like that. But at the very beginning, we talked about something else. That was creativity, and free trade brings new ideas. It always has, and those new ideas help mankind progress, womankind as well, I guess I should say, humankind. But free trade works in all those ways, and it's super important that the American people understand that, and we can benefit from it.
Yeah, I think they're good points, and I would add to your list of the military industrial complex. I totally agree on that, but also the pharmaceutical industrial complex lately has been kind of, and then,
Yeah.
and even more, not even more so, but just add to the list the social media industrial complex. I'm like,
Yes.
these guys rule the world. And I think once we recognize the role that these organizations, or whatever you want to call them, complexes, play in our lives, then we're better equipped to manage their influence in our life. So,
Well, it goes back to, and I'll shut up after this, but you were talking about the Constitution. The Constitution is quite clear that the job of government is to rein in free enterprise.
mm-hmm.
Right now, free enterprise or the big companies are running the government for all their donations. And that's the opposite of what the founding fathers intended. So have your students read the whole Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, we do.
Yes, good.
Yeah, and it's amazing how short it is. It's not like
Yes.
it's going to be a big. Where I struggle, and I personally struggle as well as my students, is, as I read through the Federalist and even the Anti-Federalist papers, that's where the discussions about what went in. Reading the Constitution itself is extremely valuable, but understanding their thought processes that went into that, I think, is even more valuable, because once you understand why they decided certain things, it's easier to say, okay, yes, this is something valuable that we need, or don't need, whichever the case may be. So and you come from academia, and I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with me here. We need to up our reading levels so that we can engage with this, various information in a meaningful way. So.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the notion of not spending money on guns, but instead spend money on books.
Yeah.
Of course, I have a new book out.
There you go.
There you go. Education is really the best investment of all.
I believe that the most profound piece of technology that ever impacted was, the Gutenberg press, because it allowed people to read, and that has brought more benefit to the world than most anything else we've ever created. Without a downside. How's that? Well, there's this, misinformation, I guess. But anyway, thank you for taking your time to visit with me today. And I look forward to your future books, and even some of I've only read Charlotte's War, so now I've got more reading to do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Really appreciate being on the show and trying to answer your good questions.
Well, thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you later.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.